Ortiz from U.S. European Command Public Affairs, and I'm here with Bill Butler, the EUCOM Command Historian. And we are going to talk to you about World War II 75 and Victory Europe Day for the next 30 minutes or so. So please leave a question, like us, share us, and let's take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think up to this point in World War II, there's been a lot of events that kind of set the stage. It's spring of 1945. The Allies had landed in Normandy earlier the previous summer. The Western Allies have kind of made their way across France into Belgium and Germany. And by March of 1945, they're on the Rhine River and ready to see this major war come to an end. So that kind of places us here in central Germany. General Eisenhower's main strategy is a broad front strategy to have all of the armies on the Western Front advancing at the same time in order to bring the war to its close. And by the time we get to April, the end is in sight, but no one knows exactly how it's going to happen, and there's still a lot of work to be done. Some other things to consider are reconstruction, occupation, things that are going to come afterwards. These things are starting to be considered by Allied leaders as they enter this critical period in the war.
And if I can just provide a little bit of context, since January 2019, service members from units across Europe and the United States have been commemorating World War II 75, including D-Day last year and Battle of the Bulge, and we are winding down to the last 2 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. And that is where we're at. Do you have a question?
So we're getting a few questions to come in. This is about battle readiness. Eric asks, fully acknowledging that the nature of warfare has changed, do you think fighting-age Americans today could rise to the same challenges that the greatest generation did?
I think it's a good question, and I would say absolutely yes. If you remember, or have maybe read, that before the war, America in particular was not prepared. We came to the fight a little bit later. We had a lot of work to do, and we did catch up to that, and we've kind of sustained that through this period, especially by the spring of 1945. American fighting prowess is at its peak, and I think we've maintained a lot of that readiness definitely in the decades since. So it's kind of a hallmark period for us, and I don't see us allowing any of that to slack in the last 70 years.
This question is about concentration camps. Liz asks, when the concentration camp was liberated, who was on hand to triage the prisoners?
So most of the camps were encountered by the U.S. military, British military. Obviously the infantry troops were there. Their accompanying medical personnel would be some of the ones on hand to help assess the status of the concentration camp prisoners and make recommendations on their care. There's a lot of information out there about how this was done, and each camp obviously represented its own unique circumstance, and the approach to each camp was different. And so I encourage viewers to go see how each camp was liberated. The U.S. Holocaust Museum is a great place to start with that and explore exactly what was happening in each location, because all through this period, Allied forces were encountering these camps and liberating these prisoners and then helping them reintegrate.
And it just so happens that next week, Wednesday, the 29th of April, will be the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau.
This next question is about soldier life. Mark asks, what was the average length of tour for a soldier during World War II?
That's a good question. I know that they varied in time period. Obviously, the longer they had been in combat up to this point, the more likely they would be considered for returning to the States at the end of combat operations. I don't know the exact answer for the period of time for each echelon of soldier, but I know that information is available from the Center for Military History and other sources.
This next question's a little bit closer to home. It's about Stuttgart. Michael asks, you're at Patch Barracks. What was that for the German military?
So Patch Barracks, or Kurmaker Kaserne as it was called, and was built in the 1930s to be a base for German tank regiments. Tank warfare, armored warfare at that time was a relatively new aspect of warfare. The German army was investing in that, and they were looking for facilities where they could house those regiments, train those regiments, and deploy them. And Patch, as it's known today, and Panzerkaserne were both brother locations. They were built together about the same time. Two different Panzer regiments were here, and their mission was to train those regiments in preparation for operations.
I have a question. So one of the things that I have been in almost a year and a half of commemorating World War II 75 that I didn't realize when I started, that when I did realize really made it more meaningful, is that, you know, for us as Americans, we talk about, we commemorate anniversaries of battles, but here in Europe, for Europeans, they are commemorating the liberation of their country, which when I realized it just made me think, wow, I have no point of reference for that in my own history, but that must have been really monumental. Can you talk a little bit about how these battles accumulated into the liberation of Western and Eastern Europe?
Sure. So obviously at the beginning of World War II, countries were falling to Nazi German armies all across Europe. Those armies were occupying those countries, and the people that lived there obviously had little choice in how things were being run. And so as the Allied armies advance on all fronts, whether it is in North Africa, later Italy, Soviet forces entering Eastern Europe, obviously Allied forces entering from France onward, the appearance of those Allied armies definitely represented an occasion for celebration, a liberation from the Nazi tyranny that they had been suffering under for many years. So I think it's really important for us to understand how much it meant to them. You still see it today at several of the commemorations at our national cemeteries all across Europe. You really see that appreciation kind of still there. You know, it hasn't faded over time. So I think to see that firsthand, and I've witnessed it personally on several occasions, is very meaningful, humbling, and gratifying to kind of see that appreciation still expressed so many years ago.
And that's really true. I've been to several V-Days as part of my job, and it always surprises me very pleasantly when I see elderly French people hug young troops from the 82nd Airborne or the 101st, as if they were themselves the ones who liberated Normandy.
So this question is again about Stuttgart. Pat asks, was Stuttgart bombed? Do you know when or where? Was it the U.S. or was it Britain?
Actually, it was both the Royal Air Force and the American Air Force. Stuttgart was home to a lot of industry that was supporting the Nazi-German war effort. And so naturally, like other places in Germany that were doing so, those facilities, Daimler-Benz, and a lot of the other facilities here in the Stuttgart area were targeted and bombed repeatedly from probably about 1943 well into 1944. Once those facilities were knocked out, a lot of that industry still remained in a smaller scale. In fact, Patch Barracks here was used briefly by Daimler-Benz employees from Sindelfingen when that plant was bombed, and they came here to Patch to continue that work in kind of a dispersed fashion. So there was a lot of destruction here in Stuttgart, without a doubt, and that was something that both the French military, when they came to the Stuttgart area, and the American military witnessed firsthand, that they saw the destruction that was leveled here in the area. And it was part of the responsibility of those Allied forces afterwards to help with the reconstruction effort in order to help the German citizens then regain their country, their independence, and their autonomy, and get them back to where they could function as a nation state among others.
This next question is about casualties. If a soldier was wounded during the VE Day operations, where would he have been sent?
There are obviously medical facilities near the front line. Those areas that were located obviously by this period of the war in France, there were several hospitals. There would be a long-standing system of hospitals in the United Kingdom. So obviously as soldiers are triaged from the battlefield to those rear areas in France and Belgium, and then eventually to the United Kingdom. In fact, my father's uncle was a pharmacist at one of the facilities in the United Kingdom during World War II, and so I know he witnessed firsthand the medical care that was given to the soldiers to see them back to the United States.
And Bill, just because the war officially ended on May 8th in Europe didn't mean that military operations stopped in Europe. I mean, there was still a lot going on land, in the air, and at sea, correct?
Right. Specifically here in Europe, I've mentioned how the Western Allied forces were advancing from France through Belgium and into Germany. And then the idea was eventually that they would meet up with the Soviet forces coming from the east. And in fact, tomorrow, April 25th, 75 years ago, those forces, the United States First Army and the Soviet Fifth Guards Army, I think, met at Torgau, Germany, where you can see those eastern and western fronts meet. That continued well into after VE Day. General Patton advanced into the Czechoslovakia, and he was meeting, his forces were meeting Soviet forces coming there. The Air Force at the time was actually conducting humanitarian missions to fly supplies into Dutch citizens in the Amsterdam area. That was known as Operation Chowhound. And then obviously occupation, policing, and governance was a big part of the duties of the military forces immediately after combat operations ended, and then the months that came afterwards. So a lot going on. And then clearly there were still operations in the Pacific. One thing that U.S. military commanders here in Europe were concerned about was ending combat operations here as quickly as possible in the spring of 1945 in order to complete operations in the Pacific. So very much in their mind, even as the end was in sight here in Europe, they still knew that there was more work to be done.
This question is from Fred, who was here as a young soldier in the 1980s. And he remembers seeing a tank under an auto hobby shop on Panzer. Any idea where that is now?
I have no idea. This is the first I've heard that. So, I'd be interested to learn. There's a lot of really interesting things across many of our garrisons here in Europe, because a lot of them, like Patch and Panzer, Kelly, Robinson, they had a history before U.S. forces arrived. I put together a walking pamphlet here for Patch that kind of explores some of the things I've already talked about. And you know, there's a lot to learn about the installations that we work on. 7 years of history, there's so many opportunities to kind of explore what's on each installation, and then in general, kind of what's happened in those 70 years. So.
Another question about the Stuttgart area. Was there anything about Stuttgart's location that made it more difficult to bomb?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. Heather asks, is there one specific battle or instance that made VE Day possible?
Wow. It's a big war, a big question. I think obviously D-Day comes to mind because from the American military point of view, getting onto the continent and confronting Nazi German forces directly was key to what we wanted to achieve here in Europe. It was part of the Grand Allied strategy of Germany first, you know, making sure that we took care of the greatest threat as we perceived it at that time. And D-Day obviously was that opportunity. It took several years to fruition. Obviously the U.S. military in particular had a lot of opportunity to build up for that. a huge, huge logistical accomplishment. Not really the beginning of the end, but definitely an opportunity for that to occur. A little bit closer to the period that we're in now, I would say the crossing of the Rhine kind of represented that final push on the western front to make sure that we could complete operations. One interesting thing I kind of learned with that too is that many of the landing craft that were used at D-Day and many of the sailors that piloted those craft actually were trucked across France and Belgium and placed by the Rhine River for that last push into Germany. And I've read some firsthand accounts from some of those sailors that how gratifying it was to be there at Normandy, to help Allied forces get ashore, and then be there on the Rhine River when they could help bring combat operations to an end. So kind of a fascinating piece of naval history. We don't really think of Navy history here in the Central European theater, but they definitely made a difference when it came to completing that. So crossing the Rhine, I would say, probably then the next big event to kind of bring the war to a close here in Europe.
And a good segue, Sean asks, in the final months of the war, the front was constantly moving. Can you talk a bit about how the lines evolved?
Can we zoom in on the map? So obviously, I don't know how detailed it gets, but if you think March of 1945, the Rhine River is running here, essentially from the Netherlands down to Switzerland. And again, General Eisenhower's idea was a broad front strategy to push all the armies from the Western Allies into central Germany. And that was the strategy they followed. Again, I mentioned the crossing of the Rhine River. Once you get across the Rhine, then you really see a lot of the armored tactics, the quick movement of American, British, Canadian, and French forces. Remember, this was a coalition effort at the time. We're taking advantage of the mobile warfare that the Germans had essentially used at the beginning of the war, and now the Allied forces were employing a lot of those same tactics to kind of bring the war to a close, and so you see a really fluid period, essentially to deny the Nazi German forces an opportunity to resist, and so the faster those Allied forces could move into Germany, the faster the war would come to an end. So things moved really quickly in the last couple of weeks.
Vivian is asking, how many fronts did World War II have, and how did the U.S. respond in handling them?
So specifically here in Europe, I've mentioned a little bit at the beginning. Before we even got on the continent of Europe, the first operation, in particular American forces, and I definitely don't want to take anything away from the operations that the British and French and other allies were conducting well before this period. But for American forces in particular, it was the landings in North Africa in the fall of 1942, kind of opened up things on the southern end of Europe. What's also happening clearly is the Eastern Front, the fight that the Soviets were having with the Nazi German forces on the east is a huge campaign that I think many times we don't really get a good picture of because our focus on American forces, obviously. So definitely two fronts by that period. From North Africa, American forces are moving into Italy and moving up the Italian peninsula, and then obviously a D-Day landing in Normandy, and then moving into Central Europe. So you could broadly characterize them as two fronts, but I think even within that, there's smaller periods of time where you could kind of see multiple things happening. And I would say that there's also an air campaign going on during this period. American, British, and other air forces are conducting a bombing campaign against Stuttgart and other locations across Germany against that infrastructure in order to bring the war to its close. There's also the Battle of the Atlantic, where we're combating, naval forces are combating the German U-boat threat. The U-boats obviously trying to interdict American logistical supply to its allies in Europe. And so that campaign is critical to what's happening in Europe. So all those working together essentially became the reasons for victory.
And Bill, you mentioned alliance. How important was it that there was a strong alliance that was fighting in World War II?
Obviously, it was critical. Many of the things I've just mentioned couldn't have been done without allies. No single ally obviously could have done it on their own. And it was that combined effort to provide a cohesive strategy, make the decisions on where the next move would be made, supply those forces in the field, both for each respective country and their allies. And so making those decisions together, there weren't always agreements. In fact, there were many disagreements, but in the end, keeping the focus on defeating Nazi Germany was critical to those allies, and essentially was the reason for success. And General Eisenhower pretty much said so. I mean, his encapsulation of the entire World War II campaign was that coalition was critical to making sure that victory was achieved in Europe.
And we've heard about, we know who the allies that we know about from World War II, the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, Canada. Who are some of the lesser known allies? And I say that because when I was at D-Day 75 last year, there were some countries that were allies that were on the beaches in Normandy that we don't know so much about.
Obviously, one of the first allies is Poland. The war begins in Poland in 1939. Those Polish troops that were able to get away and continue the fight from Great Britain made contributions throughout the war. The Greeks also were an early ally that, even though Nazi German forces and their allies, the Axis forces, invaded that country, they continued to fight. French partisans continued to fight. French troops from Northern Africa contributed, and British Commonwealth troops, obviously from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, others made contributions throughout the war. So again, and then even some in North America, Mexico provided some forces, Brazil sent forces, and then if you think beyond even the European continent, there's all kind of allies. As the war progressed, more and more allies joined the cause.
Bill, along those lines, Jen asks, what was Spain's role in World War II?
Spain was neutral, so they had been involved in their own civil war just prior to World War II, and so Franco's policy essentially was one of neutrality. So they like a few other countries on the continent, Switzerland remained neutral. Spain essentially remained neutral. There's a lot more, obviously, to explore about the roles of different European countries and their contributions during the war, so I definitely encourage folks to seek that out.
A question from Michael about our Soviet allies at the time. Michael asked, the Soviets were pushing a second front in Northwest Europe at the earliest possible date. Could Operation Overlord have happened in 1943?
I think it would have been a stretch, and I don't think that's entirely personal opinion. Getting the logistical footprint across the Atlantic, supporting a landing in northern France or other places along the European coast, I think would have presented a challenge. It was obviously not something the Allies totally agreed on at the time, so I think it would have been a stretch as early as 43. Because again, I mentioned some of the seasoning that U.S. forces in particular had to undergo to kind of get to that point, and then some of that coalition building involved some compromises over time. So I think there's obviously plenty of debate, as there are with any historical period, about what could have been accomplished, but I think 43 would have been a stretch, and 44, clearly all the Allies came together and said that's when we were going to make this happen.
Brady is asking, is there a book that captures the account of the buildup and the decades and the late drawdown of the U.S. installations in Stuttgart or Germany?
I'm not aware of a singular book. There are several publications about U.S. installations from the Army History Program. The Center for Military History is a great resource for any of these topics, World War II, Cold War, U.S. bases here in Europe. My office here is a publication about Patch Barracks and some of the Stuttgart installations. which are available for some of the personnel here, a walking tour. So there are some local publications that are done by historians across the theater. If you're at another location, I definitely encourage you to seek them out as well and see what they have on your respective locations.
And a few more questions about Stuttgart, and specifically here about Patch Kaserne. Brady asks, were the Wehrmacher and Panzer Kasernes surrendered or abandoned? And is there a narrative account of that, which you just spoke of?
That's still one of those questions that I'd like to answer for myself. I'm not real clear. I don't think that they were surrendered. There was no formal authority, I think, at the garrisons at this period. Because we're talking really late, and this is middle of April, 1945. Patch itself had been bombed at the 1st of April, so the facilities that the Nazi German forces were using to rebuild after operations against the Allies were in a shambles. So I get the sense that there was not a lot of authority on the installation, and obviously as Allied forces got closer to Stuttgart, those military forces that were occupying the garrisons here probably evacuated them, and they were kind of open to the Allied forces. But it's definitely a question I think is worth exploring, as are so many of these topics, and the information's out there somewhere, and that's part of the reward in exploring these topics, wherever you are across the theater.
A little bit more about Stuttgart. People want to know, it's actually Nathan wants to know, what happened to General Patch, who Patch Barracks is named after?
So General Patch was the commander of the U.S. 7th Army, and that actually represents another one of those fronts. I didn't mention it earlier, but after Normandy, U.S. and French forces are landing in southern France during Operation Dragoon. General Patch is the commander of the 7th Army, and their job essentially is to move up through France and become that southern end of the Allied broad front strategy that I mentioned earlier. So he commanded 7th Army all through the end of the war, as 7th Army came through this part of Germany, and then immediately after the war, he oversaw some of the occupation. He did go back to the States, but sadly in November 1945 he passed away. So not long after the war, and so in some respects an unsung hero. You've heard obviously of General Patton, you've heard of General Bradley, General Eisenhower, General Montgomery, a lot of big names in Europe, and General Patch definitely has a place amongst those, and in recognition of that, that's why Patch Barracks was named in his honor when 7th Army was located here in the 1950s.
And his son, Lieutenant Patch, was killed during World War II. In fact, he's buried at Epinal American Cemetery in France. Bill, as a historian, and I'm sure that there are many, what would you say are some key lessons learned for service members today from the Greatest Generation?
Obviously the one that comes to mind most recently is resilience. I mean, there's no question we're undergoing our own challenging time. I personally take some heart in knowing that they survived, the Greatest Generation met their challenge. I feel that in some respects, what we're experiencing today with COVID, I know we're kind of tired of talking about COVID, but we're experiencing something that's very akin to it, and I think that comment's been made a lot. So that's one of the first ones that I would think of, resiliency. You know, that dedication to kind of see things through no matter how tough it might be, and it can get tough, there's no doubt. And kind of learning from your mistakes, especially in the U.S. military. I spent some time talking about how we got into the war, how forces kind of conducted their initial operations in North Africa, and learned more lessons as the war went on that became critical to victory in the end. So I would say that would be another one. And then the history that we're able to look back on began at that period too. A lot of Army, Air Force, and Navy organizations wrote their own history, and were able to kind of use that then to look back at their experiences and then help us learn things currently. And I definitely am gratified when I see that happen still today. You know, so those programs are still out there, and that's their intent, is to help us continue to evaluate what we're doing and learn.
Unfortunately, COVID-19 has canceled any an all in-person ceremonies events for the rest of World War II 75 in Europe, to include Victory Europe Day on May 8th. The good news is that these commemorations have moved online, so if you would like to see how the 75th anniversary of US and Soviet troops meeting at the Elbe River in Torgau tomorrow, how that unfolds, please follow us on UCOM social media sites, as well as the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau next Wednesday, the 29th. And for VE Day, for May 8th, there will be some coverage from the Pentagon that we will be socializing. So please rest assured that World War II 75, winding down to VE Day, will be commemorated just online, and hopefully that means that it can reach even more people, because this was certainly, it's a milestone anniversary of an epic moment in human history. And thank you for joining us today. In case you can tell, it's our first one. And please follow on UCOM social media platforms for more World War II 75 commemoration. Big thank you to Garrison Public Affairs for setting this up. They're the experts at doing this right now. And please like us, share us, and share the video if you want. Thank you.
Thank you.